Star Wars. We all love Star Wars. Whether it's the old movies or the new movies or the movies that came in between the old movies and new movies, it's been part of our life for decades now. And whether we grew up with it and wore those, hard plastic masks on Halloween, or we grew up on it and it's now become a major part of our life and our hobby and what we do on the weekends. It's been one of those movies that's worked its way into pop culture. It's part of family celebrations, it's part of casual life, it's one of the most recognizable franchises on the planet. And that's great. And most of us know the main characters. You've got your Darth Vaders, you've got your Wookiee commander Chewbacca, well, co-pilot, not commander, Chewbacca, and you've got Luke Skywalker, the hero from the first trilogy who grows up to become a Jedi Knight. Well, there was a lot more going on in the original film, and there are some kind of hidden stories in there that part of it was because it wound up on the cutting room floor, and part of it expands the backstory. For example, this line from Luke.
Like Beggar's Canyon back home.
Well, what is Beggar's Canyon, and what does it have to do with the Death Star anyway? Why is doing the Death Star trench run anything like Beggar's Canyon? Well, to answer this, we have to go back to the beginning. And I mean the beginning of the 1977 film. First we have Darth Vader showing up, threatening Princess Leia, the droids get inside of their escape pod, and they take off for Tatooine. And this is followed by 20 minutes of roaming around the desert. Whew, now we're finally at Luke Skywalker. The droids wind up at his moisture farm. And if you think this took a long time, well, you're not the only one. The executives in charge of 20th Century Fox felt that it was way too long to meet the main hero of the movie, that we had to wait 20, 30 minutes before he even shows up on screen. So they had some notes. During the opening battle between the Star Destroyer and the Tantive, when they're firing on each other, the executives wanted to cut back, and before we even meet Princess Leia, we needed to meet Luke, since he was the main hero. So they asked Lucas to shoot scenes where Luke on Tatooine is doing what he does. He's being a farmer, and he looks up in the sky, and he sees all of these blasts and explosions. And using his macro binoculars, he zooms in and says, "Whoa, there's a space battle going on right outside Tatooine. That ain't normal. That doesn't happen here all the time." Well, of course, Luke does what Luke does and jumps in his land speeder and races to Tashi Station in Anchorhead. And there he runs into his old best friend, Biggs Darklighter. So Biggs grew up with Luke on Tatooine, getting into all sorts of mischief, racing different things, and, and genuinely causing mayhem like most teenagers do. Well, Biggs has been away from Tatooine. He left before the movie started, and he went and joined the Imperial Academy to become what would have been a TIE fighter pilot. So this is why Luke is so bummed, and he talks about all his friends leaving. They are going off and they're doing great things like Biggs did. So back to Tashi Station. So while it's great to see Biggs again, Luke says, "Well, wait a minute, I almost forgot. There's a space battle going on up there. Look, everybody, there's two ships and they're firing on each other." So Biggs and the other buddies from Tashi Station, that's Fixer and Cammy back there, they grab the micro binoculars and take a look, but at this point, it doesn't look like much is going on. It just looks like a fueler getting, with a tanker. So Fixer and Cammy continue to make fun of Luke, and come on, Cammy, she was the original Tatooine hottie, right? Woohoo! All right, so back to Luke and Biggs as they walk away in disappointment because the space battle is not going on that Luke says is. Biggs confides in Luke that he's actually going to jump ship and join the Rebel Alliance. And Luke is like, "Whoa, that's crazy." And Biggs says, "Well, I hope I see you there one day." And they do. They run into each other back when Luke joins the rebellion. Biggs is one of those rebel pilots there, the one with the mustache. All right, so that still doesn't answer the question about Beggar's Canyon and why it is like the Death Star trench run. So, the reason for all of this, who is Biggs and Luke and what were they doing on Tatooine, is important background information. What they were doing on Tatooine most of the time was racing. And what did they race? They raced these T-16 Skyhoppers, which, if they look familiar, well, yes, the design was later reused for the Imperial shuttle in Return of the Jedi, and you see Luke playing with one in his garage in A New Hope. In fact, you can see his Skyhopper behind the garage. There it is right there. So this was kind of reminiscent of George Lucas working on race cars in the 1950s in his garage. Luke, being a space farmer, was working on his space race car, which was his Skyhopper. And he and Biggs and Cammy and Fixer would race around Beggar's Canyon in these Skyhoppers. And basically the way you would win the race, obviously, crossing the finish line, but if you could pass through a natural formation which was called the Stone Needle, which was a giant rock formation with a hole in the middle. And if you were able to go through it at racing speed, you could shave enough time off of your race that you could win. So that was kind of the big challenge, was called threading the Stone Needle. And this was basically how Luke spent his childhood. That whole line about the Death Star being like Beggar's Canyon back home, well, yeah, it's flying through narrow gap at racing speed, and Luke had a lot of practice doing this. It was actually supposed to be in the movie. Concept art was drawn up because this would have also established why Luke was such a good pilot. Instead, it just became one of those tell, don't show moments where Obi-Wan says, "I hear you've become quite a good pilot yourself." And we do hear it more extensively in the Star Wars radio drama, where an entire episode is dedicated to Skyhopper racing and Biggs coming back, and we actually get to hear Luke threading the Stone Needle. Additionally, in the 1978 Star Wars storybook, if you have this from your childhood, I remember treasuring it, there were scenes of Biggs and Luke in this storybook. And this led to a lot of fans being convinced that these scenes were actually in the movie. It's kind of one of those Mandela effects where you think something happened that really didn't. And for years, fans would insist that the big scenes were in the movie at some point in some cut, maybe in like 1977. They never were, but the storybook, the radio drama, kind of contributed to this feeling. And of course, the whole racing through Beggar's Canyon was resurrected in the prequels with the pod racing, and you can see here with the Death Star Trunch.
Just like Beggar's Canyon back home.
Just like Beggar's Canyon, exactly like Luke says, racing these spaceships through a very tight area. Luke was really good at this. This is why he was not only such a good pilot, but why he was so good at maneuvering in the Death Star. He also, of course, piloted things like his land speeder, but there's also one more thing to look at. There's another throwaway line from the movie. When Luke is in the briefing with the rebellion before they leave for the Death Star.
It's not impossible. I used to bullseye womp rats in my T-16 back home.
So besides racing, the other thing that Luke and Biggs would do in their Skyhoppers is that little thing sticking out of the bottom there, that's a gun or a laser gun. And they would use it to shoot rats, not just any rats, but womp rats, which, as Luke says, were about 2 meters, which is the size of the Death Star target. So yeah, Luke would basically blast these giant rodents of unusual size, and while there has been the argument that this makes him a psychopath, well, they're not small animals. They're kind of like the size of a bear, so it's more like going hunting. So you could say that Luke was kind of a hunter, but he had an unfair advantage because he was flying and he had a giant laser gun that he could blast these things with. But, hey, they were a nuisance, and you could think of him as a farmer taking out critters that would, get everywhere. Well, once you see it, you can't unsee it. But that is why Beggar's Canyon is like the Death Star, and the throwaway line in Star Wars. That's Luke's whole origin. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please do share it with others. It helps the channel, and it feeds into YouTube's algorithm. Thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time.